There are two versions of the story of El Chapo. The version you've seen in countless often sensational TV shows and documentaries, and the other, truer version. This is a much more nuanced El Chapo story. A story that'll still make you quiver with horror but also make you question the authorities who waged the war against drugs and drug traffickers. How effective has their war been? How did El Chapo shape the war? And what has happened since he's gone? That's the version you're getting today. If we've done our job right, you'll be gobsmacked by the end of the video. In all versions, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was an exceptionally violent, cunning, pioneering criminal whose novel methods of trafficking ruinous and lethal illegal substances to the master of mass drug-consuming countries, the USA, cost tens of thousands of American lives and billions of hard-earned tax dollars. Chapo was a fiend, no doubt. His actions led to untold misery and death, but he was also a lot more complex than the Hollywood-esque master villain, the evil end boss he's been portrayed as. He was indeed at a time the world's wealthiest and most powerful drug trafficker, capable of monstrous violence. But there is much more to the story of the Mexican-American drug story that is still ongoing, despite the downfall of the supposed end boss. Chapo stayed ahead of the game for many years, in a game where longevity is exceptionally rare. He had plenty of friends in high places, and he knew how to get what he wanted from them. He was also one of those rare breeds of criminal escape artists who could achieve the seemingly impossible. His slippery nature was second to none. He'd embarrass Mexico and the USA time and again. In this deep dive, you'll see many sides of the man. El Chapo the snake, the fox, the tiger, El Chapo the lover, El Chapo the hero and legend, the innovator, the El Chapo who was more friendly to Mexican authorities, sometimes US authorities, than you might have thought. And of course, you'll learn about the primitive violence that he was capable of in his quest for unlimited power. We'll examine Chapo's bloody rise. You'll hear about his closest friends and his most ardent foes, his ups and downs, and his trade secrets. You'll see how a billionaire bandit came undone, and how a young hacker, a friend of El Chapo, played a pivotal role in that undoing. First and foremost, this show is about escapes and El Chapo's life on the run. So let's start somewhere in the middle with him running, when the US thought it had landed this biggest of big fishes, only for Chapo to wriggle off the hook and slip back into the endless pond of cross-border criminality. Why was Chapo so damn good at getting away? Here's a clue for you. It wasn't all about fast feet and a quick mind. On February 17, 2014, about 4 in the morning, somewhere on the outskirts of Sinaloa's capital city of Culiacan, Chapo was lying in bed naked next to his young mistress, Lucero Sanchez Lopez. She and Chapo were under surveillance. They had been for a long time, something Chapo suspected but couldn't quite figure out. He was in fact caught in a finely constructed, very expensive USA-made web, but he had no idea to what extent he was trapped. Still, Chapo had superpowers. He could break the strongest of webs. They both woke to the sound of violent thudding. It was Mexican Marines backed by the DEA agents trying to smash down the front door of their safe house with a battering ram. This was time-consuming. When you earn billions, you can afford specialized doors. As the soldiers struggled for 10 long minutes with the reinforced steel door, Chapo, still naked, ran into the bathroom. There was no time for finding underwear. "Love, love, come in here," he called to Lopez, who was shaking from fright. She was always love, or my queen, to him, and he was daddy to her, which wasn't too far from the truth, her being 21 when they met and he being in his 50s. She could barely believe her eyes when she saw how hydraulic pistons lifted up the bathtub. Below was a gap that led to a tunnel that led to Culiacan's complex sewer system. She climbed down the ladder after him into the muddy darkness as the bathtub closed above, following him into a maze of underground passageways. When the front door was finally smashed open, the bathtub back in its place, Marine stood there feeling confused. How does a man just vanish like that? But in the days to come, as El Chapo and Lopez navigated more safe houses and more underground tunnels, the authorities were breathing down their necks. The great El Chapo had nowhere to run, or so we heard in the Western media that parroted celebratory. As allies fell, noose closed on El Chapo Guzman, wrote AP. This former farmer, now on Forbes' billionaire list, had thought he was too powerful to ever be caught, said the press to its American readers, not all of them aware it was costing many millions of dollars for the hunt for El Chapo, that the drug war in total was costing them $50 billion a year in what had become a trillion-plus dollar enterprise. Aware of the costs or not, the public followed this hunt like it was a Hollywood thriller. Some of El Chapo's top assassins were soon arrested. His safe houses were busted. His drugs were seized, including hundreds of plastic bananas stuffed with cocaine. machine guns, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and his personal handgun, a .38 Super with his initials JGL written on the diamond-encrusted grip, were splayed about and photographed. On February 22nd, the Mexican Navy, the DEA, and the U.S. Marshals Service would capture El Chapo at the beachfront hotel in Mazatlan, his beauty queen wife and 2 kids close to his side. El Chapo was finished, said the press. The most notorious drug smuggler since Pablo Escobar was at long last at the end of his career, or so we were told. It was hailed as a victory, a milestone by the U.S. government. The Justice Department called it a landmark achievement for both Mexico and the U.S. An empire had fallen, said the U.S. authorities, embracing extreme hyperbole. The man responsible for the death and destruction of millions of lives was no more. El Chapo was put into solitary confinement, ever fearful of extradition to the U.S., where he was surely heading to a supermax dungeon. As things stood, it was estimated he owed $12.6 billion to the U.S., which the government hoped he'd settle once he was north of the border. Chapo had to get out, escape from the inescapable, from a place where he was under constant surveillance, locked up for 23 hours each day, barred from communicating with other prisoners, not even allowed to talk to the guards, or again, so we were told. As the prison warden in the movie Cool Hand Luke said, "Some men you just can't reach." El Chapo wasn't going to bow down to the authorities, he was about to perform miracles. The world's most infamous criminal, the USA's public enemy number 1, would turn into a veritable narco Houdini, whose trick would confound American authorities. The details we'll discuss later. Now let's go back in time and explain why this stocky little fella filled our TV screens and newspapers for years on end. What did El Chapo do that countless other Mexican drug traffickers didn't? What made him so special? He comes from a tiny village, La Tuna, population 280, which is about 60 miles away from the city of Badiraguato. To understand El Chapo and his near-legendary status in this rural area, you need to know what kind of place he grew up in. If you were to go to Badiraguato today, you might well get to hear the mariachi sing the song Narco Corridos, which tells us that Chapo is the lord of the mountain and the boss in the city. Rather than the villain he's portrayed as in the US, you might listen to another Chapo song that celebrates his building a tunnel of the highest quality with sophisticated construction built by the best engineers. This was a man who built roads and gave people electricity. He also provided clean water through pipes he'd built underground. Chapo's generosity had been exaggerated at times, but he did do some good things for his community, which had little faith in its government. You'll also see later in this video why Chapo is now seen as the lesser of two evils to these people. Back when Chapo was a kid, the central government had allowed the drug traffickers of the Sinaloa to grow their opium and weed, so long as the country's leaders got something out of it. The local politicians and the police in Sinaloa reaped the rewards of the drugs too, since they got kickbacks from the growers. Everyone won, except of course the people in the US suffering the slings and arrows of drug addiction and gang violence. Well, the US was a long way from Sinaloa. The government in Mexico City didn't get involved as long as the local politicians kept the peace in rural Sinaloa and ensured the peasants didn't revolt or ask for land reform. The same peasants were expected to cast their votes for the ruling party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI. In short, the drug business was ignored in the days when El Chapo was a kid, if the authorities got what they wanted. If they didn't, there was hell to pay, which usually involved the burning of crops and sometimes human rights abuses. Chapo and the people in his area understood only too well the many contradictions of government. They didn't trust power. As a Sinaloan farmer, growing weed was good business, although not as much now that many U.S. states have legalized it. Prohibition pushes the prices up and creates an underground, often violence-ridden economy. Legalization has pushed the price back down. El Chapo knew that selling drugs is good business, since people tend to get addicted to them. In Sinaloa, which was mainly dirt poor, opium crops yielded 3 times more profit than other main crops of beans and corn. It was a no-brainer. Weed and opium farming provided a much better life than other kinds of farming. But the ranchers made most of the money, not the peasant pickers, the gomeros, who'd scrape the white pus from the flour during harvest. It is likely as a child Chapo had been a gomero, But he soon figured out the money was in selling the raw opium and trafficking the powerful derivative, heroin, to its biggest fan, the United States of America. The price of opium had gone through the roof when the U.S. started opium prohibition in 1914. This was when many Chinese Mexicans started smuggling the stuff over the U.S. border for huge profits. There was good money in selling drugs to Americans. That much was very evident in the 1940s and 50s, with the Mexican Sinaloans taking over the opium and marijuana trade. They worked with the mafia in the U.S. while paying off local police in Mexico and handing bribes to local politicians. Sinaloa was an area that had been rife with rebellion. But as long as official palms could be greased and peasants could get by picking opium, the state remained somewhat stable. El Chapo moved out of La Tuna and into Badiraguato at a young age and teamed up with the men who'd become his partners in the drug trade for many years, including the notorious Beltran Leyva brothers. As you'll see later, this relationship would eventually turn sour, but not before many years of mutual loyalty. Chapo was still a small fish in a big pond when he and the brothers worked out of Badiraguato. But he was smarter, it seemed, than your average drug trafficker. He was also narcissistic enough to believe that he could be the best, not just in Sinaloa or Mexico, but the entire world. We won't get into the full story of Chapo's rise to power. Still, we'll say that the little boy who collected paper and pretended they were bills rose quickly after the famed Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo, aka the Godfather, in the late 1980s formed the Federation, also called the Guadalajara Cartel. As some of you know, Gallardo eventually had his downfall. Traffickers always do, especially when they're deemed no longer useful by the various authorities. You might have watched the Netflix series and seen the version of the story in which Gallardo is brought down because of the torture and death of the DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena. The story goes that Camarena, a brave and honest man, went after the Guadalajara cartel and played a big part in supplying information that led to the destruction of a 1,000-hectare marijuana plantation in 1984. With the help of corrupt Mexican officials, Camarena was later kidnapped, tortured, and killed. Story goes it was revenge for the weed loss. But if you were to ask El Chapo if that's what happened, he'd probably tell you no. There might not be a narco in Mexico that'll say it happened like it did in the Netflix series. The official story. The narcos, like a number of journalists, historians, and even former DEA and CIA agents, have said that Camarena had discovered that the CIA had helped, or at least turned a blind eye to drug trafficking from Mexico into the US by the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua, who the CIA secretly armed. Now let's talk about El Chapo's rise to power again. Back in the 1980s, the Americans were often interdicting thousands of kilos of their precious stocks when they'd already spent millions on bribing officials to get them to the border. So El Chapo devised an idea to stump the Americans. He headed to the Mexican border town of Agua Prieta, which is right across from the U.S. city of Douglas. The Sinaloa cartel was already rich, so Chapo had enough to hire a top engineer. He had that engineer build the tunnel from his ranch house on the Mexican side to the warehouse of a construction company he'd bought, Ready Mix, on the American side. The tunnel was a feat of engineering, leading from a pool table in the Mexican house that could be lifted with hydraulics. In the tunnel, a cart could be pulled to the other side, about 200 feet away, where another hydraulic platform would lift up a drainage gate. So rather than deal with pesky border patrol, Chapo now just pumped drugs into the U.S. until his heart was content, and he was hardly ever content. Between 1988 and 1991, 35 tons of coke went through the tunnel and successfully landed in the U.S. Chapo was getting rid of the stuff so fast that the Colombians, also getting very rich, nicknamed him El Rapido, the Speedy One. The Sinaloans were making so much money that they opened currency exchange shops in Mexico using the American cash that was also being smuggled through the tunnel. The man in charge of taking care of all that cash was Miguel Angel Martinez. Life was good for Chapo and the others in the Sinaloa cartel during the tunnel days. They had more money than they could have dreamed of. They paid off police, judges, and other officials. And if someone wouldn't accept the payment, they were given a choice of a bullet or a bundle. They usually chose the bundle. In the early 90s, Chapo had a house at almost all of the most famous Mexican beach resorts, including a $10 million place in Acapulco. He had ranches in almost every state, a zoo with lions and tigers in one of them, and a little train for kids to travel around the zoo. He had 4 personal planes on top of all of his trafficking planes. It was never enough. Rather than sit back and watch the money roll in, he branched out, heading to the hills of northern Thailand, where the very strong China white heroin was being made in what was known as the Asian Golden Triangle, Thailand, Myanmar, and Laos. The Golden Triangle's opium heydays had been in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but Chapo went after the white stuff in the 90s, which was much higher quality than the brown heroin being made in Mexico. But in the criminal world, the good times don't last. U.S. officials had been hearing things about a lot of coke going through Douglas, and on May 9, 1990, they found Chapo's tunnel after busting a truck carrying a shipment. Chapo called Martinez and screamed, "This is bleeping over! They found the tunnel!" The good news is that 900 kilos of coke was sitting in a warehouse on the Mexican side. It was better than losing everything. Chapo changed tactics, shipping the coke to the U.S. inside cans of what should have been chili peppers. While Chapo was well known for such innovative techniques, the Arellano Felix brothers in Tijuana were better known for their savagery, especially Ramon, torturer and executioner of people who it was rumored had often not done much to upset him at all. Cops, journalists, and snitches were treated to extreme brutality in a soundproof torture chamber. If you looked at Ramon the wrong way when he was out drinking in a pub, you could be shot dead. His brother Benjamin was far less brutal. He was said to be the brains of the operation. The brothers didn't care much for Chapo, whom they considered a country bumpkin. They saw themselves as cool city guys, educated, while Chapo was half literate. They were the Los Urbanos, and Chapo belonged to the lowly Los Serranos. They saw him as a dumb upstart, and it seemed Chapo wanted to prove them wrong. To cut a long story short, the brothers had a connection with a Venezuelan trafficker who decapitated the wife of Hector Luis Palma Salazar and stole $7 million from her. Salazar was old school, a gunman for Gallardo back in the day and a later associate of El Chapo. The Venezuelan Rafael Enrique Clavel not only took the head of his wife, but he drove to a high bridge and threw her children to their deaths. This was a wicked, wicked man, but these were dangerous, dangerous times. Without anything holding the powers together, a united Mexican states of traffickers of sorts, blood-splattered anarchy was almost guaranteed. There was always going to be violence between El Chapo and the brothers, not just because of slights and murders, but because the brothers would charge exorbitant amounts of cash to move drugs through Tijuana. They had the best crossing by far, and they exploited it, making them enemies all over Mexico. The problem was they also had a small army of men, often bored kids from Tijuana. And on the American side, they had members of the Mexican Mafia. They had more muscle than any of the other cartels and improved on that by inviting ex-army and corrupt police to train their men at their camps in the mountains. The brothers saw themselves as kings. They were untouchable, but El Chapo didn't see it that way. As a reporter later put it, he had an idea to build a tunnel in Tijuana that was far bigger than his previous one, the Taj Mahal of tunnels, moving more product than the brothers could dream of. This wasn't going to end well. In 1992, things were already bad. A lawyer who was working with Gallardo was killed in prison. Gallardo was on the side of the brothers in this schism, and the killer of the lawyer was El Güero, aka the wifeless and childless Salazar. He shot 8 of the lawyer's family members. Just a month later, 6 of Chapo's guys were found in Tijuana dead on the side of the road. A car bomb then exploded at one of Chapo's houses, and later, by chance, El Chapo was driving and saw Ramon and his men. They opened fire on Chapo. This was war. Chapo was given solid intel that the brothers would be in a nightclub at the resort town of Puerto Vallarta on November 7, 1992. This was a Saturday, so the club was packed with vacationers and locals. Chapo's men went in with assault rifles and lit the place up, hitting innocent people as well as some of Ramon's men. 6 died and many more were injured, but Ramon had been tipped off and was able to escape. The Mexican government later got in touch with the mediator between the two cartels, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, Lord of the Skies, regarding his ability to transport drugs for everyone. He himself was worth about $25 billion in the 90s. It was decided Chapo was the one who had to go. Fuentes died in 1997 after having plastic surgery to change his face. This wasn't unknown in the trafficking world. Colombian drug lord Juan Carlos Chupeta Ramirez Abadia, who'd later testify against Chapo, also got a face job. The move that changed everything was on May 24, 1993, when the brothers were expecting El Chapo to be at a Guadalajara airport, thanks to their tip-off. As Chapo was pulling his car out of the car park, a group of men ran toward him firing guns and spraying the car with bullets. Chapo's bodyguard tried to fire back but was hit in the foot, just as Chapo picked up a suitcase full of cash and sprinted away toward the terminal, where he ran through the door, his suitcase bursting open to spill bills all over the floor. As Chapo tried to stuff the bills back in, the gunman followed, firing automatic rifles at him and his men, who managed to get through the hole in the baggage carousel and find the outside tarmac. It was total chaos, but they somehow got to the road and flagged down a taxi. Outside, in the airport car park, a man named Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo was slumped over dead in his car, a Mercury Grand. It wasn't just any man. He was the Archbishop of the See of Guadalajara and a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, this accident was supposed to look like a man of the cloth, one of the highest men of the cloth in Mexico, had just been hit in the crossfire, but that is highly unlikely. Ocampo had throughout his life fought for the rights of the poor. He'd been outspoken about the rampant corruption between the cartels, the government, and the police, so the chance of him being an accident that consisted of 14 bullets in his body, is pretty slim, but that's what the Mexican authorities led the public to believe. This poor man, said the news media, had been accidentally killed by warring brutes. A $5 million bounty was put on Chapo and the brothers' heads. It was Chapo who initially seemed to lose out the most. We can't say exactly what the brothers did, but we know they both managed to meet with the Vatican's head in Mexico and chat despite them being the most wanted men in the country. What was said, no one knows, but it seems that Chapo was going to take the fall for the death of Ocampo. He should have hidden out in the mountains of Sinaloa, but he opted to go to Guatemala, where he was arrested on the border and handed over to the Mexican authorities. In no time at all, he was sent to the Federal Readaptation Center No. 1, about 50 miles from Mexico City. As soon as he got there, he was a showpiece, his face all over Mexican TV. The fact that the guards holding him weren't covered in masks tells us that Mexico was a much less scary place back then, because in the years to come, any man known to have guarded a narco would likely have his family murdered. Still, El Chapo didn't seem overly concerned about this setback. He didn't seem overly depressed at all at getting 20 years for drug trafficking and bribery. They tried to get him on the murder of the cardinal at a later date, but the case was thrown out. Nothing much changed. The drugs kept flowing, the feud continued, and the bodies piled up. Meanwhile, Chapo was imprisoned at Puente Grande in Guadalajara. He bribed everyone in the running of that prison, and we mean everyone. He lived like a king, ordering lobster for dinner and eating fresh salmon for breakfast. His personal chef was being paid $1,518 a month, an excellent wage in Mexico at the time. Depending on what they did for him, other guards on his payroll were being paid as much as $4,210 a month. The warden was on $5,260 a month. It was a happy day for everyone involved. Chapo got the latest cell phones, he had designer shoes sent to him, he had women delivered to his cell at any hour of the day, and of course his wives and lovers. He already had about 8 children, some of whom would grow up to work with him. He also was allowed to conduct all his business from prison, and he could see any of his men anytime he wanted. Martinez took control of many of his affairs, such as looking after his money, properties, and planes, and his huge piles of drugs hidden in various warehouses. Outside of prison, the free trade agreement with the US and Mexico went into effect on January 1, 1994, which made the wealthy in Mexico much wealthier, while good union jobs in the US fell by the wayside. The Guardian reported, the promised trade surpluses with Mexico turned out to be deficits. Some hundreds of thousands of jobs were lost, and there was downward pressure on US wages. This was good news for the cartels, who were always looking for new employees. El Chapo didn't think much about the trade agreement at the time, but he did care that part of the NAFTA agreement included Mexico promising the US that it would crack down on corruption, mainly many officials getting rich off the likes of El Chapo. El Chapo might have cared about President Bill Clinton and his administration promising to get tough on drugs. The DEA soon grew into a much more formidable outfit, and now the Cold War was over. The CIA wouldn't be protecting Mexico's finest. Stopping the spread of communism always took precedence over stopping drugs flowing into the states, but now the commie threat was pretty much done and dusted. The DEA was about to see its budget increase. Chapo was worried, so he wanted to have a quiet word with the DEA. And when we say quiet, we mean very quiet. There'd be bloody repercussions if anyone was found out he was speaking to the DEA. The man who would have had that chat with Chapo was Bond, Joe Bond. Bond was a veteran of the drug war. He volunteered to be part of Operation Snowcap when the DEA, with the U.S. Border Patrol Tactical Unit, worked with police and military from South American countries to get on top of the drug problem. Bond did 90-day stints in the deepest jungles of the continent, relying on his training with the Navy SEALs and Army Rangers to survive. For all intents and purposes, he was a special ops man, an excellent asset to the U.S. government, where the seemingly unwinnable drug war was concerned. On November 7, 1997, when he was posted at the U.S. Embassy, he received a message from Chapo's brother-in-law. Chapo wanted to talk to Bond, something the U.S. government was very wary of, considering risks. But the interview was eventually given the green light. Bond was going to speak to the man who had become one of the most powerful drug traffickers in the world. Bond, of course, didn't just roll up to the prison himself, otherwise Chapo's life was in danger, as was everyone in Bond's group, plus their family members. Prison staff would very likely have let it be known that Chapo was speaking with one of the U.S.'s main agents in the drug war, so Bond pretended to be a sociologist, as did the two men who went with him to the prison. José Luis Santiago Vasconcelos, a dependable Mexican lawyer involved with Mexico's war on drugs, and José Pepe Patino Moreno, one of those rare breed of Mexican drug prosecutors who was completely incorruptible. These kinds of honest officials in Mexico live in a world constantly fraught with danger. Their bravery is astonishing, considering what has happened to many other incorruptible officials. Chapo said he told the Mexican drug war investigators in the PGR how to catch the brothers, but they hadn't acted on his tips. Chapo didn't know that he was sitting across from a top PGR man in Moreno. Chapo said he believed he couldn't trust the PGR, otherwise they'd have already had the brothers in custody. He said that if he and his family's safety was guaranteed, he'd give the DEA what they wanted: information on all of Mexico's top drug traffickers, minus his own men, of course. He was trying to play the DEA to take out his enemies, which is common practice in the criminal underworld. He said he'd give them everything, but he also wanted his charges in the U.S. resolved so he wouldn't be extradited at any point in the future. El Chapo told Bond and the other men, "I will speak honestly to you, and I will give you my word on everything I am about to say." He said the brothers were more dangerous than him, that they had double agents giving information to the DEA. He even told them where the brothers were doing most of their smuggling on the border, but he wouldn't give them the names of the major politicians who were protecting them, likely because he knew that that would be his death sentence, and they were probably taking money from him too. He'd said that he'd give them the names of the traffickers and where they were hiding. He'd tell them where the drug stashes and the weapons caches were. He'd give them the lowdown on all the local officials being paid off by the brothers, but only after they moved him to a different prison, since his life would be in danger in Puente Grande. As the 2-hour meeting was almost up, he told them something extraordinary. He said that the brothers were about to assassinate Mexico's Attorney General and also the ambassador to France. He said the brothers were going to make it look like it was his men that did it. This wasn't so shocking. Politicians dropped like flies in Mexico. They still do. In 2021, U.S. news media reported that 100 Mexican politicians had been murdered in just 6 months in the run-up to the election. Bond was more shocked when he told them that he wouldn't be having a follow-up meeting with El Chapo. Prosecutors in the U.S. said it might harm future cases against Chapo. Bond was outraged. He knew that with the information Chapo could give him, the DEA could bring down many bad guys. Was it worth it? It was if it kept the murder rate down, if it reduced harm, which is all he ever expected he could do. Chapo hadn't gotten what he wanted, so it was time to leave the prison in what would be the second best escape in his life. On January 19, 2001, after 8 years inside, he decided it was time to go. With help from his brother Arturo El Pollo Guzman and his partner in crime for many years that we've talked about already, Ismael El Mayo Zambada, and a prison guard who ran the laundry, nicknamed El Chito, he formulated his escape plan. He really had to get out. There was no time to spare. Some of the prison staff Chapo had been paying were now under investigation. The entire prison was looking at a corruption probe focused on Chapo and 2 other wealthy inmates. But worse, the U.S. was trying its darndest to get him extradited, which would essentially be the end of his life. The day before Chapo had escaped, the Supreme Court of Mexico ruled that people such as Chapo could indeed be extradited without much bureaucratic pain as long as they did not face the death penalty. At 8 p.m. on the 19th, El Chito pulled up outside Chapo's cell with his laundry basket. Chapo got in and covered himself with sheets, and El Chito rolled on. There were 8 points, gates nicknamed diamonds, on the way, each with guards that had to press a button and allow the person to go through. Each time Chapo heard the buzzer, he breathed a sigh of relief. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, almost there. And then at one point, a guard wanted to chat with El Chito. He let go of the cart and it hurtled down a slope. Chapo thought he was done. He considered making a run for it, but El Chito caught the cart and went on his journey until Chapo could smell the air outside. A car was waiting on the grounds. Chapo scurried over and jumped into the trunk while Chito drove toward the last checkpoint. the gate to the outside world. This huge metal gate, the Pluma, was closed. A guard did a cursory check of the car, then waved the man controlling the gate. Chito drove on. Chapo was free. But yet again, this is the story you see in the TV shows and the newspapers, but it's also possible that Chapo simply said his goodbyes and walked out of the prison without a care. The story didn't put Mexico's justice and correction systems in the best light, which is why the exciting laundry cart story was invented. So goes this theory often talked about by Mexican journalists. In the years to come, El Mayo would stand in a U.S. court and talk about how El Chapo's monthly bribery budget was $1 million. He would also say Chapo had told them about his anxiety inside the laundry basket. So the Mexican journalists who didn't believe this story might be wrong. Whatever really happened, for Mexico and its then-president Vicente Fox, it was a huge loss of face. It just looked like more corruption. The Americans were less than pleased, but they'd seen nothing yet. No sooner than El Chapo was back with his boys after escaping, he was briefed by El Mayo. El Mayo's guy in the military had been told that special forces were going to come after Chapo. Still, Mayo had made many official friends while Chapo was imprisoned. After picking up El Chapo that day, they drove him through the many police blocks. Jesus El Rey Zambada, El Mayo's younger brother, was driving. He'd even arranged an escort consisting of police motorcycles. PFJ agents stopped them at one point, much to Chapo's surprise. El Rey told him, "Don't worry about it, these are our people. They're here to protect us. No one's going to touch us from now on." Everyone was super happy, El Rey said many years later. Things were looking bright for the Sinaloa cartel. They had their new connections in high offices, which was bad luck for their sworn enemies. El Chapo decided it was time to return to La Tuna. He could be more relaxed there. He could also concentrate on the opium and cannabis business. He knew that by supporting the local economy and building up all the cannabis and opium crops, he was safe. No one would give up a guy who was making local people money, even if he was charging each farmer 30% of their income for keeping the military from burning their crops. Chapo concentrated on taking out his trafficking nemesis, the Felix Arellano brothers. The Sinaloans got Ramon on February 10, 2002, when corrupt cops on Chapo's payroll pulled him over in the street in the city of Mazatlan. A gunfight ensued and Ramon ended up painting the sidewalk with his own blood. Seems El Mayo had fed Ramon information about himself being at a certain hotel in the city, but this was a lure, and Ramon paid for it with his life. Up in the Sinaloa mountains, according to later testimonies, Chapo was beside himself with joy. He couldn't stop talking about it. The way they'd done it. Reports said Ramon had gotten down on his knees and put his hands up, and the cops executed him. For Chapo, this was like hearing poetry. Then came Benjamin, the Brains. Mexican police arrested him at a house in Puebla, southeast of Mexico City. Just like that, Chapo's greatest enemies were gone. If this all seemed a little too convenient, it's because it probably was. Chapo's men now had the best government connections, and the brothers had lost their connections and their strength. They'd had 150 tons of cocaine seized in the last 18 months. Someone, it seemed, had wanted them gone. It's rumored that the Fox government had worked with Chapo and had even helped with his prison escape in return for the good old days, with Chapo as the head honcho paying massive bribes and keeping the peace. There's no solid evidence that this is what happened. Fox seemed a lot straighter than those who had come before him, but Chapo became king of the castle without that much effort. The Mexican authorities take blood money from the cartels. They like the cash, but they don't like the warfare. It makes them look bad. That was a pity because things were going to get much worse. President Fox might not have been on Chapo's payroll, but Garcia Luna definitely was. Luna was as good as it gets regarding having a man in the government who's got your back. A man the New York Times described as Mexico's ex-top security official and the J. Edgar Hoover of Mexico. Luna had been the Coordinator General for Intelligence of the Preventive Federal Police and later became the Director of the Federal Investigation Agency, like Mexico's FBI, which was supposed to put an end to Mexico's cartel problem. Little did the Mexican public know that Chapo was sending him suitcases filled with millions of dollars. When Luna served as Secretary of Public Security in the federal cabinet of Felipe Calderón while being promoted as a tough-on-crime enforcer, he was in bed with Chapo. Well, not literally. Chapo couldn't lose with Luna on his side. He now had the power to keep his enemies at bay and keep his drugs flowing to the USA without much interruption. He had just become, as the US would later say, the most powerful drug trafficker in the world. He was the Godfather, the new Pablo Escobar in terms of ridiculous wealth, the Al Capone of the devil's dandruff, and so, eventually, the US public enemy number one. The DEA was tracking him down with its new big budgets, but with Luna helping him, the DEA was always going to be chasing a ghost. Chapo soon started earning huge amounts of money by using trains to traffic his cocaine. The coke would be hidden in fake tankers fitted with secret compartments stacked with many kilos. Each trip was worth about $30 million. Even the middlemen were pulling in a few million a trip. The money would be smuggled back into Mexico or used to buy diamonds in the US, which could also be smuggled in and then sold. Bribed workers in Mexico would weld the compartments into the tankers and then spray over them. After the tankers were filled, there was little chance any authority would ever find the drugs, sometimes as much as 1,800 kilos, that would be quickly hoovered up in the US. It's thought that the train trips to the US earned everyone involved $500 to $800 million in total. Chapo still had competition, notably from Los Zetas, a cartel that had split from the Gulf Cartel. Los Zetas would ignite an immense amount of violence across Mexico. It was started by Arturo Guzman de Sena, a former Mexican Army Special Forces officer whom the U.S. Special Forces and the Israel Defense Forces had reportedly trained. He was an elite soldier, a narco-mercenary, who understood the value of psychological warfare. He employed medieval methods of torture to frighten his enemies, and of course, his enemies also upped the ante of violence. Los Zetas brought a new level of violence to the trafficking game, sometimes cutting off the captured enemies' heads with chainsaws and filming it. They flayed men, they fed men to crocodiles, they used an oven to cook men at one of their torture houses in Veracruz, where they were paying about $20,000 a month to corrupt cops. They were involved in massacres of civilians and countless kidnappings. One of the volunteers who searched for missing people who'd found one of the houses of horror told the press it was the worst thing I've ever seen, worse than any horror film. He added, practically the whole country is a mass grave. The whole world needs to know that people were dissolved in acid in Mexico because the government allowed it to happen. As we said, they often videoed their executions as a way to intimidate their enemies and law enforcement. In one video, they had captured a man in his late teens. While interrogating him, they laughed and said to their enemies to send us more mugrosos, or dirtbags. They smashed his joints with a club, then severed his limbs with a machete, finally taking off his head and shooting bullets into what was a collection of body parts on the ground. From 2006 to 2012, as the cartels were pushed out of their comfort zones in the new drug war, Mexico would experience next-level brutality. Even though many thousands of arrests of cartel members were made and many gang members were killed, Chapo's Sinaloa cartel came out of this war relatively unscathed. As you know, they had Luna on their side, but President Calderon, it's possible, was aware of what was going on and might have also lined his pockets. Mexico became the most violent place on planet Earth during Calderon's crackdown, which was put in place because of rising levels of violence. About 120,000 murders took place, 60,000 civilians went missing. The Mexican public didn't see positive results. They witnessed rivers of blood. In Michoacán in September 2006, cartel men walked over the dance floor in a nightclub and dumped 5 severed heads onto the ground. Stories like these made the news almost daily. Amidst the cartel beefs, life became more dangerous for women as the cartels engaged in widespread femicide. Women would set off to work in the morning and never come back. Some got in taxis and were never seen from again. Some were assassinated, while others were trafficked. Some were disemboweled and hung from bridges. Some were decapitated. Between 2006 and 2021, close to 43,000 women were killed in Mexico. This is according to the National Public Security System, which said the killing of women happened in an effort to control communities that had become cartel war zones. The widespread violence against women was a testament to how brutal, how low Mexico's cartels had become. In the past, organized crime had often sworn to leave women out of the violence. The cartels showed now that anything could happen. They had descended to the nadir of human depravity, and all for power, all for the greenbacks over the border. The violence hit Sinaloa badly when Chapo and the Beltran-Leyva brothers finally parted ways. One of the brothers, El Mochomo, was arrested by Mexican Special Forces in Sinaloa in 2008. To cut a long story short, Chapo was blamed, and what followed was a virtual massacre. It should be said that we now know that U.S. secret cables sent by the State Department suggested that Chapo had indeed tipped off the Mexican military about El Mochomo. The Leyva cartel then allied itself with Los Zetas. The commander of Mexico's National Federal Police who'd announced the arrest was shot 8 times and killed in what the New York Times called the most brazen attack so far in the year-and-a-half-old struggle between the government and organized crime groups. In 11 days in Culiacan, 54 people were murdered. Cops, officials, friends of families, relatives, friends, basically anyone who was associated with either one of the sides. Residents were afraid to leave their house as trucks sped around carrying men in balaclavas, carrying AK-47s. Dozens more were killed in the weeks ahead. One of Culiacan's newspapers wrote the headline, "Welcome to Culiacan," over a photo of a shot-out window on so-called Black Thursday. Residents near a shopping mall heard bazookas being fired along with AK-47s that ended the life of Edgar Guzman Lopez, the son of El Chapo. The drug war raged on over the coming months and years. The drug war did manage to drive out some major criminal groups, but the vacuum was almost immediately filled with another armed and dangerous group, often smaller factions of the larger group. It was like chopping up worms only to see them multiply. Even the anti-cartel outfits who tried to protect people from the cartels sometimes got involved with crime when they'd driven out the cartels. There was good money in power. The demand for drugs was always there during the war, so the supply would always also be there. The only way to win the drug war, it seemed, was by taking away the demand, which was another problem altogether. It was a different kind of war, a health crisis, that guns and prison cells evidently couldn't fix. In 2012, Enrique Peña Nieto became the new Mexican president, and like his predecessor, he promised to get tough on crime. He'd later be accused of asking for $250 million from El Chapo, after which El Chapo came back with a counteroffer of $100 million, if indeed the witness who said that was telling the truth, one of Chapo's men, the Colombian drug lord Alex Cifuentes Villa. Chapo certainly did seem to have a four-leaf clover in his pocket. Things went relatively well for his cartel during those first years of the drug war, and as you'll now see, Chapo seemed to have the use of a crystal ball when it mattered the most. But he also started to struggle as the years passed, as the Mexicans constantly militarized their anti-drug forces and the Americans piled on the money while providing much-needed intelligence. At times, Chapo's $1 million a month bribe bill wasn't enough to maintain his good fortune. In 2009, he lost a shipment of 6 tons and another 9 tons a few months later. This was devastating even to a billionaire. He was paying between $150,000 to $200,000 every single month to stay hidden in his mountain hideout in Sinaloa for food, security, and a long list of other employees. It all added up as Chapo became increasingly paranoid. Rightly paranoid, the noose around his neck was tightening. That's when he met with a man who would change his life, a 21-year-old Colombian tech whiz named Christian Rodriguez, who dropped out of college to start a cybersecurity company. He was just what El Chapo needed, a man who could make communications hidden from the prying eyes of the American and Mexican authorities. In 2008, Rodriguez was flown in a Cessna over Chapo's opium country to Sinaloa, where he was met by armed men in military fatigues. They drove him by a four-wheeler into the mountains and then to the middle of seemingly nowhere on the back of an ATV. At the house, Chapo's right-hand man, Alex Cifuentes, who we just mentioned, did the introduction. Chapo was all ears, while the young millennial tech geek explained to him how Chapo could use a totally private messaging system. Rodriguez pledged they'd set up a system for Chapo, a private network that he could use for all his communications. The system, he said, was impregnable. The messages would be end-to-end encrypted, a term not yet used by most people outside the tech world. Rodriguez tried to explain in the simplest terms what that meant, that Chapo's communications could only be read by him, that the data would look like gibberish, mixed numbers and letters to any possible prying eyes. Rodriguez was ahead of the game. Encrypted apps would become popular around 2010, but this was 2008. The network, he told Chapo, would even be impregnable to veteran hackers, the kind of people the FBI liked to hire. Chapo said he'd give him $100,000 if he could build this system. Rodriguez, formerly a good guy, was now stepping into the shadows of high crime. Once the system was up, Chapo grew more confident. One of the men he most frequently spoke to was Damaso Lopez, aka Licenciado, a former lawyer at Sinaloa's prosecutor's office. He became the man who oiled the wheels for Chapo regarding bribes and official business. Lopez had become a cornerstone for all of Chapo's operations. He had many officials in his pocket. Chapo trusted him almost as much as he trusted his own sons, who were already playing a major role in the family business. Later, we'll introduce you to his son, Mini Leak, who also plays a big role in the story of El Chapo and Mexico's cartel business. For now, let's just say Mini Leak and Chapo's sons did not get along too well after certain things transpired. When Rodriguez built the system, Licenciado gave Chapo better internet access in the mountains. Chapo was impressed, so one day he approached Rodriguez with another question. He told Rodriguez he wanted spyware. Chapo liked spying on his men, but also his many lovers and wives, who were now integral to his trafficking business. He'd always loved his gizmos and gadgets as a means to watch the police and keep an eye on his underlings. It's another reason why Chapo stayed ahead of the game. For an almost illiterate man, he had an impressive grasp of surveillance technology. He'd once spent $500,000 on tech that helped him to intercept military phone calls. Hence, the military often wondered how he always seemed to know they were coming. Rodriguez came back and told Chapo that if he wanted to spy, then a spyware program called FlexiSpy would do the job. He told Chapo that once it was on a device, Chapo would take control of it. He could read people's messages, their emails, see what they were doing on their various apps, and know their exact location. Chapo was already impressed, but much more impressed when Rodriguez told him that the infected computer could be made into a listening device by turning on the microphone. Chapo had always used special phones with his men and girlfriends. He gave them out and told them not to use anything else. He had Rodriguez put spyware on all these phones, always Blackberries. He got Rodriguez to secretly infect laptops. To say the least, Chapo loved his new toy. He infected so many phones that he even had to hire a secretary to monitor them all and report back to him. Life was good for the man who was always at risk of being ratted on, cheated on, or delivered to his enemies. On February 3, 2010, with Chapo now keeping tabs on everyone in his inner and wider circle, Rodriguez was in a hotel in New York, supposedly meeting a shady Russian guy who was in the market for encrypted devices to run his rather illegal enterprise. That's all Rodriguez knew, that the guy was Russian, dodgy, and he needed help in the form of Rodriguez's services. Rodriguez was getting paid well by Chapo, but he always had his sidelines. Little did he know the FBI was watching him. During that meeting with the Russian, they were listening from the next room. Rodriguez talked about his line of business. He told the Russian what he could do for him. He could get him special phones. The FBI had just struck gold. There was no Russian mobster in the adjacent room. He was an informant, a real Russian with a thick accent who looked the part and agreed to meet Rodriguez in what was called Operation Surferjack. But getting Rodriguez to talk wasn't enough. It didn't matter that he told the Russian that he had special clients, not mentioning Chapo by name, of course. The FBI needed serious dirt, a felony crime, to scare him into working for them. Setting up encrypted networks is not against the law. So they pushed. The Russian said, "I'm bringing a load of cocaine up to New York next weekend. I'm going to use your phones to coordinate the load." Rodriguez took the money, they shook hands. In the next room, the young agent Robert Potash, a rookie in the FBI's Latin American drug squad, C-23, smiled at his partner, Stephen Marston, a veteran drug war agent. What they just heard was a conspiracy to traffic drugs, enough to put someone in prison for a long time. The rabbit had been snared. But the FBI kept tabs on Rodriguez before approaching him. In the year they watched him, he made many trips to the mountains to see Chapo. One time, Chapo had a request that even Rodriguez, who was now getting used to craziness, couldn't believe he heard. Chapo asked, "I want you to install spyware on every single computer in Culiacan. Can you do that?" Over 800,000 people, thought Rodriguez. That was some request, but Rodriguez thought about how it might be possible. He looked around him, at the AK-47s, at the AR-15s, the .50 caliber machine guns that Chapo had told him were to shoot down helicopters if any should fly over his hideout. That was one of the many moments when Rodriguez asked himself, "What the hell am I doing?" That was the day soldiers did indeed arrive, and Chapo, his men, as well as Rodriguez had to hike through the mountains and sleep rough. All the time, Rodriguez later said that Chapo was as cool as a cucumber. A year surveilling Rodriguez was enough. The FBI had learned a lot about Chapo's operations, but they needed Rodriguez to open new doors now. They got him in Bogota with the help of Colombian cops. The FBI had no powers to make an arrest in Colombia, but they could at least speak to Rodriguez. The cops found him at the airport in Bogota and steered him to the back of a Toyota. Potash sat in the back with Rodriguez. Marston was in the front passenger seat. Potash turned to Rodriguez, who was evidently in shock, and said, "Hey, we're the FBI. We need to talk." Rodriguez, shaking, said, "Yeah, okay." He later said, admitting to the FBI agents that I worked for a public figure such as El Chapo was very difficult. No kidding. If Chapo knew about this meeting, Rodriguez, maybe his entire family, could be tortured and killed. It took a while, but the agents eventually broke him. He talked, he let it all spill out. He made a deal with the devil. He admitted a Faustian bargain. He told them that he was a black hat hacker with ambitions to be a white hat someday. Chapo's money, he said, would help him realize the dream. The FBI was soon reading Chapo's messages. El Chapo, the thug. El Chapo, the savvy businessman. El Chapo, the man with many lovers. Every day they listened to Chapo's conversations. He talked about grenades, he ordered AK-47s, he asked for regular household supplies. He might ask for machine guns and toilet rolls in the same sentence. He waxed romantic with his girls, chatted with hitmen, smugglers, and arms dealers. It was a busy life. In one call, one of his closest men, El Guano, told Chapo that there must be a snitch. The cops knew too much. Chapo said no snitch, just make sure you always use your BlackBerries, phones the FBI was listening to, that Chapo for some reason thought were safer because their servers were in Canada, not the US. Now his precious BlackBerries were running on a server paid for by the FBI. He used his mistress, Agustina Cabanillas Acosta, to meet with suppliers directly, which was a huge risk for her. He had her contact buyers in China, Australia, LA, and Detroit. He got her to find out where he could buy precursor chemicals for methamphetamine and fentanyl, as far off as Germany and China. Chapo evidently did get into the fentanyl business, even if his son would later say he was against it. He sent her on private jets, black flights to Belize, Venezuela, Ecuador. He told her he loved her and sent her to do business in the lion's den. With Chapo's movements being so closely watched, it was extremely dangerous for him to leave his hideout. But that's exactly what he did in April 2012, when Mexican federal police almost got him when he was staying at a coastal mansion in Los Cabos, a resort town at the southern end of the Baja California Peninsula. This wouldn't be the last time Chapo was almost caught. The Americans started to wonder if Chapo wasn't being informed about the raids, as he always seemed to get away by the skin of his teeth. This happened when the Americans tipped off the Mexican Marines, and they raided his ranch in the Sierra Madre Range. It was as if he'd known. An American official joked, every time he gets away, they tell us, he got out the back door. There's no word for surround in Spanish. Chapo had stayed at the resort town on several occasions. He was bored of the mountains, and keeping the cops and the army off his back in Sinaloa cost him a fortune. So he often swapped his combat fatigues for a t-shirt and his trusty ball cap and went to the beach, although his luggage always included a bag of grenades and an AR-15. Relaxation wasn't really in his vocabulary. Using U.S. intelligence, a Mexican special ops squad, and drug detectives knew Chapo was staying at a 2-floor villa at the end of the cul-de-sac, a house with its own pool and a water slide. The forces again did not set up a perimeter, something the U.S. agents waiting down the street could not figure out why. They were handing Chapo over on a silver platter, but it's likely Chapo was handing someone else over some gold. Chapo was gone by the time they busted down the door. They found his clothes all over the bedroom, papers documenting his business activities, his Nike size 9s, a receipt for a liposuction Chapo had just bought Agustina, his AR-15 was there, his grenade launcher was there, as was his bag of grenades, but he wasn't. 3 Black Hawk helicopters flew above, not seeing Chapo when he ran outside past the pool, through a line of bushes, over a wall, onto the road and into a car. 2 hours later, his mobile phone rang. It was Emma. "Are you okay, love?" she asked, sounding worried. "All is well, love," he replied, not sounding the least bit concerned. He told her, "I'll get back to you later. Love you all." He then told her that he had to leave stuff at the apartment as he had to get out quickly. So, could she get him some shampoo, aftershave, and underwear? And since he was about to change his mustache, some scissors and mustache dye. The problem for the FBI was that Chapo had now been spooked. He knew they were somehow tracking his movements, but he didn't know how exactly. Then, on January 7, 2013, they listened in on a call that turned their blood cold. It was Alex Cifuentes talking to one of Chapo's relatives. He wanted to pass a message to Chapo. "Send my regards," said Alex, "and tell him that Rodriguez was the one who blew the whistle." Alex had been digging up information on Rodriguez through his secretary, Andrea Velez. He told her to send someone to find Rodriguez. Rodriguez was aware this was happening. He knew this day would eventually come. He also was well aware what these Mexican cartels did to snitches. It would not be a simple death. There would be hours of agonizing torture, probably followed by some medieval-type execution. Little did Alex know that by this time Rodriguez had already been moved into the U.S. with his family. Marston and Potash then went after another of El Chapo's staff to turn into an informant. They were well aware that these people's lives would forever be destroyed and that they were putting them in danger, but without informants, the job of a drug investigator is nigh on impossible. This time they chose Andrea, Alex's secretary. She was used to working in a stressful environment, one time acting as a ruse so Chapo's men could kidnap an Ecuadorian army chief. If things had gone wrong, she could have been killed. This was the life, something she often thought about escaping. But once you were in with these guys, it was not so easy to get out. The Americans showed her a way out. Work for them and they'd remove her from Mexico and set her up in the States. Meanwhile, the Homeland Security Investigations Department, HSI, had put wiretaps on Chapo and was gathering even more information. Chapo was caught in the middle of an American intelligence tornado. It was surely only a matter of time until he was sucked up in that dark storm. Since the Los Cabos bust, Chapo had changed his tack, using a complicated system to send messages in which he never touched a phone himself. This involved using many tiers of communications, where operatives far away would communicate messages to other operatives, and all those messages could bounce around, a bit like using the dark web. If Chapo wanted to send coke to Canada from Ecuador, there was no longer one direct message, but a complex web of messages. It wasn't quite as good as what Rodriguez had set up in terms of technology, but it was still very hard for the HSI to crack. They discovered, after analyzing these webs of messages, that Chapo had a buyer in Central America who would get the product from Colombia to Ecuador. They found out that Chapo had a landing strip in Belize. He had a guy in Guatemala who had pilots that would fly the product into Mexico. They learned that he would occasionally have people assassinated, such as a cop in Baja California, who Chapo said had to go. He even had a guy deep in the jungle of Colombia making the cocaine base, which Chapo planned to be moved onto boats. The tornado was moving closer and closer to Chapo. Then, in November 2013, Alex was arrested, a huge blow to Chapo. He still had El Nayo, his co-leader. The two were shipping massive amounts of coke, many tons, into the US, and trafficking huge amounts into Europe, into places such as the UK, which, like the US, was a major market. His brutality became evident when the HSI listened to him order the murder of his nephew. The nephew, Juancho, had been caught lying to Chapo about his whereabouts. It didn't mean he was snitching, but Chapo was taking no risks. He had his hitmen capture Juancho and his bodyguards and torture them before killing them. His young lover, Lopez, was scared. She noticed a change in Chapo. He'd become a desperate man, a paranoid man. She wanted out. And then on that fateful night with him in February 2014, she was woken up by the door being smashed down. There were monitors in the room showing masked men with a battering ram. She and Chapo could hear them as they stormed the room. By that point, they were already in a tunnel, but the raiders knew better than to follow a cartel boss into a dark tunnel. There was a good chance it had been rigged with explosives, or they'd be machine-gunned down as soon as they took a step inside. They had to let him go. Chapo and Lopez ran into the muddy darkness where they passed the occasional block of light where the street grates were. When they got out near a canal, helicopters whizzed above their heads. They were both filthy. Condor, Chapo's secretary, was also with them. He said that they should just jack a car, but then he got one of Chapo's guys on the phone and arranged a pickup. It was time to leave Culiacan again. After the Mexican Marines got hold of one of Chapo's guys, Picudo, they used a technique that almost always produced results: torture. Well, at least that's the theory. Picudo told them that Chapo had headed to Mazatlan on Sinaloa's Pacific coast. Dressed as tourists, the Marines went in pursuit, aided by intelligence the Americans had given them. On February 22nd at about 4 a.m., HSI agents told the Marines that Chapo was holed up at the Miramar Hotel. The Marines found him in a room on the 4th floor. Chapo didn't even put up a fight. What could he do? It was just him, Condor, Emma, and their 2 kids. Emma pleaded with the Marines not to shoot while shielding the kids. The most wanted man in the world looked at the Marines resignedly as if to say, "Okay, you got me." The New York Times reported, with an army of guards and lethally enforced loyalty, he reigned over a worldwide multi-billion-dollar drug empire that supplied much of the cocaine and marijuana to the United States. Past tense. He was finished. U.S. and Mexican officials basked in their victory, this resounding success in the war on drugs. Chapo was first taken to the Federal Readaptation Center No. 1, a maximum security joint better known as Altiplano. No man had ever escaped from this place, surrounded by razor wire and numerous guard towers, a stretch of no man's land that could never be crossed. Not even air traffic was allowed to fly over the prison. It was a fortress, a place where frequency jammers prevented any prisoner from using a phone. It was supposed to be the prison of prisons, a dungeon that held some of Mexico's worst: the killers of Los Zetas, members of the Gulf Cartel, the extortionists and kidnappers who had plagued Tijuana for years. The Mexican authorities boasted that Chapo was locked down 23 hours a day in a cell where CCTV was on him all the time. Escape was impossible. Not even the guards would speak to him. Meanwhile, Chapo was probably thinking, "Didn't I pay someone tens of millions of dollars for this to never happen to me?" President Nieto was quick to tell Mexico what a great day this was for justice. The U.S. held press conferences after press conferences, stating that the world was a safer place and that justice had been served. Chapo was in his prison cell, thinking about his next move. First things first, he thought, is some house cleaning. He'd been caught, so that meant his security might have been compromised. He managed to get a message out to Damaso, demanding that his security chief, known as El Negro, had to go. El Negro had started out as an anti-narcotic soldier, but like so many cops and soldiers in Mexico, he had gone to the other side when the money was better. El Negro had done his fair share of kidnapping, torturing, of killing. Maybe this was karma. His body was later found in the street. He'd been tortured and riddled with bullets. Chapo got letters out to Damaso via his lawyer. He told his sons not to trust anyone. "No one should know where you all sleep but yourselves," he said in one letter. "The danger," he said, "will likely come from the inside." There was a snitch. Chapo was sure of it, but still unaware that the Americans had been surveilling him for years. Damaso ran the business, making sure the product was bought and trafficked. He paid the families of fallen henchmen who'd worked and died for Chapo. He split the main profits between himself and Chapo's 4 sons. He paid the bills and the accountants. Chapo told Damaso to find the guards and administrators at his prison and offer them all bribes. He wrote in one letter that he'd been lucky because the director had been very kind to me. Still, it was nothing like Puente Grande. He didn't have the run of the prison. He'd definitely be sent to the U.S. This time he couldn't wait long to escape. He told Damaso to help him plan this escape before the Americans got hold of him. At 8:52 on July 11, 2015, just 18 months after he was caught, El Chapo Guzman was again a free man. That camera in his cell looked at emptiness, a sparse room with a bed and a table and a shower stall, within a wall that was only waist-high. Chapo had vanished. How was this possible? He'd been virtually entombed. One of the last shots of him showed him in his beige prison gear. On his table in his cell was a roll of toilet paper and a phone he shouldn't have had. So much for frequency jammers. He stood up, paced around a few times, walked over to the shower stall, and was gone. This was like a trick a magician might present to an audience. What the camera couldn't show was Chapo dropping through a 20 by 20 inch hole in the shower room. About 3 foot down, there was a ladder made of PVC piping. 30 feet below that was a tunnel, one of Chapo's trusty tunnels, which, like his former tunnels, was a feat of engineering, at least for a drug trafficking outfit. There was a ventilation, the tunnel was safe, and oxygen masks hung at various sections, just in case. The DEA would later say that the tunnel cost at minimum $5 million. Someone had spent a better part of a year removing 3 tons of dirt, making sure no one saw where it was dumped. There was also a motorbike on tracks, where Emma's brother was waiting to take Chapo to the other end on the evening he escaped. Chapo got on the back and they drove off down the tunnel for about a mile to the other end. There they met with another shaft leading to the floor of an unfinished house that Chapo's people had been building. The two then used an ATV to travel to a nearby warehouse, from where they got in a blacked-out SUV and headed to an airstrip about 2 hours away in Querétaro State. By the time the pilot was telling Mr. Guzman to strap in, guards at the prison were only just starting to figure out what had happened. A sparrow was fluttering around in the empty cell, the bird that Chapo had used to check the air quality in the tunnel. The prison security certainly hadn't been as tight as the media had led us to think. In a few months, the BBC would run the headline, "El Chapo's Escape, Prison Chiefs Among 13 New Arrests." The arrests went from the guards to the control room to Mexico's Secret Service, all the way up to the country's national coordinator for the prison system. 2 prison directors were fired. As President Nieto wiped the egg from his face, he assured the world that Chapo would feel the full weight of the law. Still, that might have depended on how much truth there was to Chapo feeding him $100 million in hard cash. How had anyone not heard them digging the tunnel? The answer is they had. Inmates had complained for weeks as the tunnel was being finished, that the drilling and digging was close to their cells. The constant noise had kept them awake at night. But of course, all their complaints were ignored. The American authorities were furious. It had cost multiple $billion to take Chapo down. He was soon back in La Tuna with his feet up, celebrating, sitting on his balcony with family and friends, toasting the people in the world that could always be bought. His cousin, who was there, later told the journalist Noah Horowitz that Chapo would always return when they least expected it. He'd invite friends and family over, said the cousin. The homecomings were big parties. Such events were always joyous, he said. The party soon ended. Chapo had work to do. He gathered what was left of his main men, his sons, Damaso's own son, and they had breakfast in the mountain overlooking the nearest town. The meeting had one agenda: the future. but this time Chapo wouldn't have much of a future. A few months later, before the sun came up, heavily armed Mexican soldiers decked out fully in army gear burst through the door of one of Chapo's safe houses in Los Mochis, Sinaloa. The DEA, the FBI, the HSI had all been tracking him and had sent the Mexican forces to that house. Chapo's gunmen fired from the roof. A firefight broke out as they charged through the rooms. Smoke filled the house as the wounded and dead lay on the floor. 5 of Chapo's men were dead by the time they got to Chapo's bedroom, where a closet door was open and a hole led to a tunnel. Chapo had scurried through the tunnel with Cholo Ivan at his side as the men had fought above. By the time the Marines got to the tunnel entrance, Chapo and Cholo had already emerged through a hole in a Walmart car park. This time, there was no pickup truck, so they pointed their guns at a driver and took his old VW. The car only took them a few blocks before it broke down, so they hijacked another car. This time, Chapo didn't have the police on his side, guiding his escape. It seemed Chapo's luck had run out. His official protection had come to an end, as it always does with the drug traffickers. About 12 miles outside the city, they ran into a police roadblock. Soon, Chapo and Cholo were in the backseat of a squad car, handcuffed, bare-chested, both men looking like they had the weight of the world on their shoulders. El Chapo's Mexican run was over. It was time to face the music in the USA. He was sent to Altiplano and almost immediately gave Damaso $100,000 to find a house nearby. However, this time the Mexican authorities were wise to his tricks and they kept moving Chapo from prison to prison. He had $2 million sent to his top official in the correction system in an effort to get sent back to Altiplano, but this time the bribe didn't work. His spell of good fortune had finally run dry. On the 19th of January 2017, Chapo was spirited out of his cell and onto a private jet that took him to waiting U.S. Marshals at MacArthur Airport in New York State. He almost cried. The reality of a life in prison was awaiting him. He was done. It was game over for Shorty. He now lives in a dungeon, locked down 23 hours a day, mostly in silence. He will never ever escape. But it wasn't game over for the Sinaloa cartel or the many other cartels that fought in the vacuum that El Chapo had left behind. Things in Mexico went from bad to worse, which you now know was highly predictable. The year after El Chapo's arrest, the media reported about the most murderous year yet in Mexico, as a new powerhouse syndicate rose to prominence and fought it out with the new-looking Sinaloa cartel. The Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, or CJNG, with its new end boss, Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, brought a new level again of violence to Mexico. The cartel was reported to be renowned for its brutality and its willingness to attack government forces, something El Chapo was often wary of doing. Admittedly, he had a lot of them on his payroll. A recent study said the cartels employ 175,000 people in total, making them the 5th largest employers in Mexico. Over the last few years, there's been an uptick in the frequency of massacres related to the cartels, too many for us to detail in this video today. The murder rate in Mexico from 2017 to 2022 hit record numbers, way worse than the cartel wars back in 2010 to 2012, when the Mexican war on drugs went into overdrive. In 2011, there were 27,213 murders. 2014's 20,010 was an improvement, but following that, 2016's 24,559, 2017, when Chapo was gone, 32,079, 2018, 36,685, 2019, 36,661, 2020, 34,515, 2021, 36,000 even, 2022, 31,127, 2023, more than 30,000. Only 4% of homicides in Mexico were solved in 2023. This was the year that 5 medical students were tortured and killed at a water park. 12 security personnel were ambushed and killed in Coyuca de Benitez. 4 bystanders at the hair salon were shot down in a crossfire, and 11 partygoers at a pre-Christmas party who apparently offended a few young men were massacred, likely the consequence of an ongoing turf war. At a post-Christmas party in Ciudad Obregón in northern Mexico, 6 were killed and 23 were injured when a cartel opened fire on revelers. Is the war on drugs being won? And if so, who is winning? Who won after El Chapo went away? Now you need to watch another deep dive, murder trial of O.J. Simpson, or have a look at Inside Area 51.